because I'm living in Mecca.
Ah,
About
and he's
about
honest.
Washington
That's
D.C.
right.
Right?
Yeah,
Yeah, he was honest, but he said it in a way that no one would understand except me. I mean, it was cryptically
yeah,
said, but he was humorously kind of going along with
yeah,
me. And his point, yeah, I'm in Mecca, I'm in America. I'm not gonna,
yeah.
I can't preach the
I have
Medinan
no
version
power
to
in it.
you.
Yeah,
Right, right.
and
And
this
I think
explains.
that. Go ahead.
Well, it explains so much, and I know, I think probably my most fascinating interview of all time, and his name escapes me. He's in my first book, but this was the gentleman who was the lead radical in Britain who ended up in prison. Um, what's his
Oh yeah, Anjem Choudhury or
Anjem Chowdhury, true
uh,
radical. But
yeah,
I love this guy. He was honest
yeah,
because he'd say, "Look,
yeah,
most Muslims don't want to tell you the truth because of this dynamic." So
yeah,
he was just bold enough and believed in Islam so much that he would say, "Look, this is what the book teaches."
yeah.
And so their cowardice, they lie
Right.
with Western audiences because they're cowards and they're not strong enough to say, this is Islam.
Huh? Huh? And I agree with you about, I find those, the radical Muslims, I find them refreshing in the sense that
Yes,
they're honest.
yes,
And ISIS, the Islamic State, for all their disgusting atrocities that they've
yes,
committed, they wrote a very, I thought, I love citing it, even though it's hidden now by the algorithms, but they wrote a piece called Why We Hate You and Why We Fight You. And it goes out of its way to tell you it's not because of your politics. It's not because you've done anything bad to us. It's not because you support Israel. He said those are all, the article said these are
it's
all
all work.
secondary.
Yeah,
They're secondary.
yeah,
And he said the reason we really hate you is because the Quran commands us to hate you,
yeah,
and we have to wage jihad, and we have to do that.
yeah,
And he cited it. And so, yeah, those kinds of Muslims are definitely out there and refreshing, like I said, because they actually, the other ones are really more dangerous. The ones who preach
yeah,
moderation because they're
yes,
basically a fifth column, and
yes.
the whole purpose is to cause you, not to scrutinize Islam and to get your guards out
Stay
until
asleep.
as they
Stay
gather
asleep.
strength.
Yes,
Right.
of course. Yeah, and I'm just going back. Okay, so 10 years he's back to Muhammad. He's trying peacefully to build his following. It's not really going well. Also, historically, it's interesting and explains a lot what we see in the books later on. There was a fair amount of mocking that's recorded in the books. Talk about that. Who was he being mocked by, and what did that result
Yeah. When he was in Mecca, especially, the mockery began. Muhammad thinks he's a prophet. Muhammad thinks God's talking to him, and they would poke at the holes and the gaps in his
in? And
message.
the contradictions too. Yeah.
And the contradictions. Like I was talking about Aisha, she found every time he seemed to have he would want to do something in which he knew because she's his wife, his favorite wife, supposedly. All of a sudden he would come tell the Muslims, I have a new revelation, one which works directly in
That's for me.
advantage of what he wanted to do. So
Yes.
that thing was very obvious to them, but they did mock him a lot. And in fact, the laws, the blasphemy laws, which we see today all around the world, the burnings of Qurans and
Yeah.
whatnot, and all the rage that goes on, traces to him. He's the one who first called on his followers to execute and assassinate people who mocked him. And this includes one woman, and because, the Arabian Bedouin society is very given to verse, poetry.
Yeah.
And so they would make mocking, doggerel about him. And so he would send assassins, including one woman who they stabbed her while she was, suckling her babe. And an older man, a Jewish man, Ka'b ibn Ashraf, who also famously mocked him. And this anecdote is even more telling because what? So basically, Muhammad put up his hands and screamed and said, "Who's going to kill this man who's an enemy of Allah and His Prophet? Always Allah and His Prophet." Um, you know, and one young Muslim volunteered and said, "I'll go assassinate him, but to do so, I have to lie and say I'm not a Muslim because obviously, if he knows I'm a Muslim, he's not going to want anything to do with me, and I have to get into his confidence and good graces." And Muhammad said, "Do it." And the young Muslim went and started telling Ka'b, "Oh, Muhammad's a fool. I agree with you. I was with him. I left him." And slowly they became friends until at one point Ka'b let his guard down and he beheaded him. The young Muslim brought his head to Muhammad and everyone screamed Allahu Akbar. So that sort of thing, when you see it happening today, you have to understand it goes straight back to the source, Muhammad. And the mockery. See, the thing is, this mockery has been with him from the start. There's no other religious leader who had this, and which is why it's so pivotal to silence it. It's also pivotal to silence it because if it goes on without being suppressed, more and more Muslims will sort of agree and they'll break away. The same thing with the apostasy law for Islam. Yusuf al-Qaradawi is a very world famous sheikh, where he died recently, said if it wasn't for the apostasy law killing Muslims who try to leave Islam, Islam would have died in its crib. There's definitely a lot of truth to that.
Fascinating.
But
yeah.
one last point about the mockery. All the same fellows who had mocked him in Mecca, when he finally came back, especially the chieftains, when he finally came back a decade later and conquered them, there's even, again, the sources are just just so ingenuous. And they say, he went up to one of the leaders who had mocked him for 10 years. And he said, what do you say now? I forget his name, Abu Sufyan. He says, what do you say now, Abu Sufyan? Am I not the prophet? And Abu Sufyan says, even though he had capitulated, as to that, I'm not sure. And then one Muslim next to Muhammad says, say it now or we'll cut your head off. And then he says, yes, you are the prophet of Allah. They all say, Allahu Akbar.
There's a doctrine.
So even in the sources, you just see all the doubts and mockery and coercion and do it or we'll kill you.
And Raymond, with the mocking too, it was, I mean, if you go back and read it, he wasn't a theological expert, yet he was citing, Judaism and Christianity. And part of that mocking, especially with the Jews, is like, oh my gosh, you don't know the scriptures. That's embarrassing. I'm being colloquial, but that's kind of the idea of what's going on. So he had a special enmity, not just for that Jewish man, but for Jews in general. Is that a fair?
Initially, this enmity was not on display for Jews or Christians, and he actually would speak well of them. But then later on, again in the Medina phase, he beheaded a whole tribe of them on some pretext. And then the verses, like you say, the theology is so misrepresented. He says the Jews are condemned in the Quran because they believe in, I forget his name, some historical character, which is the same thing with Christianity. He abjures and condemns the Trinity because he thinks the third person is Mary, the mother of Jesus. Yeah. So definitely his theology is very shaky. Yeah. And the sad thing is, despite all the wrong things that the Quran and Islamic history gets about Christianity and Judaism, the Muslim response today is, no, you guys have it wrong. Yes. So it's your Bible, which was written and collated centuries before the Quran, is wrong because the Quran contradicts it. Yeah. And so that's their logic, sadly.
Yeah. And let's just talk about battles and violence. So many people would say, well, there was violence going on, but that was his followers. But I think the books themselves contradict that. How many battles was he involved? How many deaths was he personally responsible for?
Oh, I wrote about this, and I can tell you right now. He was actually involved, or he waged, I can pull it up right here, if you want the exact number, but he waged something like 20 battles.
28 battles,
20, or more, more like 30. Battles, exactly, that he participated in. And again, the whole reason for these battles was not because he was defending himself or Muslims. He was basically, you're an infidel, you're a kafir, you're a non-Muslim, you're our enemy, because that's what he preached, and he said Allah told him, and that's what the Quran says. And it was basically a caravan raid. He'd go and he'd butcher everyone and plunder them and steal their goods, and that's how he empowered himself. And so the idea of appropriating and stealing money from the infidel, that's as kosher as it gets when it comes to Islam. The fellow you mentioned in England, Anjam Chowdhury, as one example, I had a video of him saying, the jizya, which is non-Muslims who live under Islamic rule, have to pay tribute so they don't get killed, especially people of the book. And he said that he was getting all this governmental aid in the UK because it was a form of jizya. He's like, of course, they're paying me. I'm the Muslim overlord, and they're the slaves. So it's only right for us to take governmental, aid. And he was stealing it too. In other words, he was apparently lying and saying, I don't know, he had more kids than he didn't, whatever. So the idea of plundering and robbing the infidel goes straight to Muhammad as well, because that's how he empowered himself and his followers, and that's how, if we can talk about that, all the initial caliphates, sultanates, that's what they were all about, just appropriating other people's wealth, including their bodies, as slaves, because Islam is by far the greatest slave master of world history. Yeah,
and again, so going back to the beginning, I never really put a knot on this one or put a bow on it. But okay, so Muhammad's out there for 10 years, trying, doesn't have a great following, and then this doctrine comes where it's like, wait a minute, we can evangelize by the sword, we can subjugate by the sword, and a lot of us followers are like, wait a minute, and that's where you even see the verses in the book, and just correct me on all this, but you even see the verses in the book where he's like, look, you may not like this, I understand, but this is the command of Allah. This isn't me, this is the command of Allah, that we must use the sword, we must bring everything under the command of Allah. And then, so when he then had this doctrine where it's like, you can go take, and it doesn't all come to me. They can raid, and they get women, they get money, they can steal gold, homes, etc. All that was a doctrine that came up after 10 years of a lot of work and no following. And then Islam explodes. Is that a correct reading?
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. 10 years of peaceful preaching brought nothing, 150 followers. Then once the modus operandi changed to, hey, we're going to preach by the sword, and by the way, you're going to get rich, you're going to get women and slaves and plunder, and if you die, you're going to get even more rich and more women.
Yeah.
And it became a win-win. Then it snowballed, and the more he conquered, the more people joined the bandwagon, because that was the way to that's the way to win and survive and get all the pleasures of this world and the hereafter.
Yeah. Okay. And by the way, everything you're saying, you can go back, and this is coming from the holy books. This is coming from the Quran and the Hadiths.
This is the Quran, the Hadith, which is the recorded words and sayings of Muhammad, and also the Sirah, the biography, which is one of the oldest. I mean, they're all old, the Hadith, but it comes out around the same time, 8th or 9th century, which is a very comprehensive. This is what Muslims themselves go to, the biography, which is very thick in Arabic. And that's the one, if you read it, the author's name is escaping my mind right now, but I have it right here. And anyway, that, if you read it, where it's so, you can read right between the lines, and the hagiography is not, it's there, but it's, you can see right through it. And all you were reading about is a guy who was disenfranchised, and then he became powerful, and then he just went full-blown jihad, war on everyone, and became richer and stronger and more powerful. It's very, very obvious.
Yeah. And then...
and this is why, just to add to that, from the very start, when Christians, and we'll talk about that, criticized Islam, they got it entirely from Islamic books that were accessible to them. And the very first Christians were those who could read Arabic, like John of Damascus and so forth. And they read these, and they were like, what are you talking about? I mean, this is just a bandit, who was killing people. And one of the very even earliest accounts is of a Jewish scribe who's asked about, have you heard of a prophet who's coming from Arabia? And this is maybe a year or two after Muhammad's death, or 5 years or so. And his response is, don't believe such tales, for prophets don't come on war horses and chariots and kill and murder. Okay, and so it was very obvious from the very get-go, from the start. But to those who joined the bandwagon, they had to keep the narrative. We're not doing this because we're a bunch of bloodthirsty murderers. We're doing this because we're following God. They need to wear the mantle of righteousness to justify themselves. And that's been going on for centuries.
Raymond, is going back to the conversation, that very long conversation that I have recorded with Anjem Chowdhury. My favorite part was, so first of all, he came ready to battle, because that's what he had to do all the time right now. I mean, in his life, he's battling theologically all the time with people. And here I come along and I say, look, I'm like you, I'm a fundamentalist. So I understand you, and I respect you, because you will speak, and you source what you're saying, and you have principles that you stand on, and you're courageous. So I really like it. And he almost didn't know what to do. We had the most fascinating conversation because his guard came down. So, but then at the end, I said, listen, Anjem, I just want to kind of get into this before we leave. And I said, there have been many false prophets. Why do you follow Muhammad? You've obviously invested everything. You've invested your life and your eternity in this man. And yet, if you look at him, he was very different than any other prophet or perceived religious leader, because of the violence, which I'm not calling him violent. It's just, you look in the books. He was violent. So, that opened up a fascinating conversation. And we started having some connection problems. So I had to call him back a few times in this conversation. there's no badgering. It was all done in
Yeah.
love. I really just had a heart for the guy, and it was fascinating. But yeah, all that to say that this is from the holy books. He was very different, as you said. What other religious leader comes on a war horse? And we'll jump ahead. We're not going to jump ahead in the interview, but just to that point of Islam is different. It's not just a religion because it's a political system. It's theology. It's political. It's tribal. It's extended family. It's control of all your life. It's everything. So it's so different trying to talk to the person who's not well versed and trying to understand Islam because they just view it through a normal lens. And to the point, too, that, look, many Muslims, they don't understand who Muhammad was. And they're taught that he's like Jesus, right? And,
Yeah.
and so if you open the Bible, there's not a big disconnect. But so many of them believe that, and it's so hard to really turn their mind because it's like, this is his man, this man is perfect, he's the prophet, everything he did is perfect. Well then, okay, let's look at this instance. What happened here? What did he do with that woman there, those women? And it's such a weird disconnect. You've run into that, I'm sure.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about. It is a weird disconnect because on the one hand, you're right. So many Muslims who are otherwise good people don't know their own scriptures. They don't know about the violence and the bloodshed and the jihad, especially if they're in the West or influenced by the West, because they, like Westerners, think all religions are the same and they're good and they just preach love and tolerance, and they sort of conflate Christianity with it. But then, like you say, when you bring these up, two things can happen. One is if they're critical thinkers and they're being honest with themselves, they'll eventually apostatize, even if it's just in their heart.
Yes.
The other thing is, either out of stubbornness or because of tribalness, this is my religion, or because they actually start because they themselves have criminal inclinations and they start liking what they're hearing, which is, oh yeah, you can have sex slaves, oh yeah, you can rob someone if he's of the wrong faith. Then they start liking it and just agree with it. Well, that's what it says. That's how we have to be. So you definitely have different categories of what they do with that information once it's made available to them.
Yeah, fascinating. I remember a conversation with an Egyptian in Egypt, and he was former radical, and he wasn't born as a radical. He got more and more radical before his conversion to Christ. And he said, looking back, he said, I realized, this is just what you said, he said, I realized the longer and the deeper I went into Islam, the worse the person I was becoming. Because then he started to understand really the bones, the structure of this religion and what they were really called to do. And you either have to buy in or you apostatize, like you said, and so many do. Or like, look at what happened with ISIS after ISIS and their brutality became so well known and all done in the name of Islam. So many said either it's a bunch of religion is a bunch of crap and I'm done with all of it. It's all bogus. And many others went to Christianity. They saw Jesus there, like, my gosh, that's the antidote. That's who I thought Muhammad was, but he's the antidote to that. So I don't know if you have any comment on that.
No, what you were saying, I'm very well aware of. Especially because I watch Arabic, satellite and internet, and they're constantly having these debates. And I know so many Muslims who've apostatized and become Christian, and also, like you said, those who just become secular or atheists. And this is something that's raging often in the Muslim world, and this is why why these laws like apostasy and blasphemy are so fundamental to Islam, because without them, Islam would cease to be. While you were speaking, the idea came to me, which is interesting. Is to a secular Western person, let's say, they will, with a broad brush, say you, for example, as a Christian and a radical Muslim are both fundamentalists. Okay, which we can say is true. You go to the fundamentals, you go to the Bible, they go to the Quran. But the irony is, what they don't take into consideration, because they just kind of lump all religions together, is that even though you're both fundamentalists, you are diametrically different because the books are diametrically different.
Absolutely.
Okay, the Bible, the New Testament, preaching tolerance and forgiveness and brotherly love and altruism, and then you have the Quran preaching violence and intolerance and subjugation and et cetera, et cetera. And so it's funny because the more pious a Christian becomes and the more pious a Muslim becomes, the diametrically opposed they go. And so this is why it's also important to be cognizant of this sort of divide when one uses words like fanatic or fundamentalist.